Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Oxford Global Studies seminar on a book by Federico Fabbrini. And this book is the EU Constitution in Time of War, Legal Responses to Russia's Aggression Against Ukraine, published by OUP 2025. Extremely timely. And in this book, Professor Fabbrini examines the EU response to Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. The EU has done a lot. It's provided military and financial support to Ukraine, adopted sanctions against Russia, and opened procedures for its enlargement to include Ukraine. Federico's book argues that understanding the constitutional dimension of the response is crucial and asks, is the EU a peacetime organization forced to adapt to wartime? If so, how can this happen, especially in key areas like the common foreign and security policy, fiscal and economic policy? And what is the impact on the EU constitution? So the way we're going to proceed is that Federico is going to give us a short introduction to his work, followed by comments from Paul Craig and Catherine Barnard. I'm going to give a very short introduction to the three of them here so as not to interrupt the flow of discussion once it gets going. After that, there will be time for the panel to discuss, and if there's time, also time for people to ask questions online. But this is a short session, just 1 hour, so we'll see how we go with time. So starting with Federico, short introduction. Federico is full professor of European law at Dublin City University School of Law and Government, as well as founding director of the Dublin Brexit Institute and Dublin European Institute. He holds a PhD from European University Institute and has also held positions in the Netherlands, Denmark, and the United States. He has authored, I think it's 5 monographs, but it may be more, and multiple volumes by him have been edited on EU law and politics. At least 10 of them, possibly all with OUP, I'm not sure, particularly focusing on Brexit, EU governance, and fiscal capacity. And he frequently engages with EU institutions and national governments. Then first of all, Paul Craig, FBA, Emeritus Professor of English Law at St. John's College, Oxford, and a leading EU and public law scholar, will offer his comments on Federico's book. Paul spent his academic career at Oxford and is the author of a number of legal textbooks, the most well-known of which is EU Law, Text, Cases and Materials. He will be followed by Professor Catherine Barnard, who is Professor of EU and Employment Law, I think I'm right in saying that, and Fellow and Senior Tutor of Trinity College, a leading EU and employment law scholar and author of many well-known textbooks and monographs on EU and employment law. She is Deputy Director of the UK in a Changing Europe Movement project. So I will pass over to Federico to introduce his book to us all, and then we'll be followed by comments from Paul and Catherine.
Thank you so much, Shauna, for your kind introduction. Perhaps too kind. It sets the bar too high in presenting me so in such a flattering way. And I'm really very grateful to you for suggesting in the first place of having this book discussion and book presentation within the Oxford Global Society platform, which I want to thank for hosting us today. And then I'd like to warmly thank Paul Craig and Catherine Barnard for agreeing to serve as discussant in this book. I should disclose that both Shauna, Paul, and Catherine have been friends for many years. They all served in the advisory board for the Brexit Institute that I set up at DCU about 10 years ago. And it is really a great honor for me to be discussing my work with the three of them today. So I have prepared just a few slides to accompany my presentation, and I hope you can see all the fight that I am sharing. So the book title is The EU Constitution in Time of War: Legal Responses to Russia's Aggression Against Ukraine, and was published by Oxford University Press in February of this year. So for the third anniversary of Russia's large-scale invasion against Ukraine. And I should also disclose from the start that actually the book identifies a cutoff date in its analysis, which is November 2024, at the time of the US presidential election. I had to decide on a moment when to stop writing, and I figured that perhaps the US election might bring in some additional elements there. So the book only covers development until early November 2024. Before I jump into the topic of the work, let me just say, and Shauna was kind enough already to point that out in her introduction, in the last few years, I have had almost a perverse interest in a series of crises that have affected the European Union. So I worked on the Euro crisis, I worked on Brexit, I worked on the pandemic and changes to the EU. So in a way, this project is somehow a follow-up, because the war in Ukraine was just the latest in a series of crises affecting the European Union and the project of integration. However, I also think the war in Ukraine is somehow a special crisis and different from the one the Union had faced so far. And this is because ultimately, as I try to point out in the introduction to the book, the EU is a peacetime organization. The EU was never really conceived to be an organization for wartime. We all know the historical origin of the European project in the aftermath of World War II, the desire to prevent the return of continental wars between major European powers, especially Germany and France, the Schuman Declaration, the founding act of the EU, stating that we should make war not only unthinkable, but materially impossible. And basically, from that point of view, the EU has been an extraordinary success. But the same success that the EU has had in building internal peace resulted also, I would claim, in a certain in a certain attitude by the European Union, forgetting about the importance of external affairs, defense, security, and even hard power, partly because all these were delegated to another organization, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So if this is true, if the EU was primarily focused on peace, internal peace, then Russia's large-scale aggression against Ukraine really posed an existential challenge to the European Union, because it forced it to deal with the reality of hard power for the first time since its existence. And so if this analysis, if this assessment is correct, if this starting point, if you will, is correct, then you appreciate what the purpose of the book is. If the Union is facing its first war since its existence, what has been the European Constitution? How has the European Constitution fared in time of war? So the book endeavors to examine the core measures that the EU has taken in response to Russia's aggression against Ukraine, the consequences that these have had for European integration, and the challenges that they pose for the European Union in the long term. Now, in terms of structure, the book is basically divided in 5 substantive chapters that focus on the 5 core policy areas of EU lawmaking, which have been affected by Russia's aggression against Ukraine. So first and foremost, I examine the common foreign and security policy, the set of rules and policies dealing with foreign affairs and defense. Secondly, I examine economic and fiscal policy, how the Union has dealt with issues of money and budget. Thirdly, I examine the area of freedom, security, and justice, what we call, with a typical EU law jargon, the AFSJ, including immigration, internal affairs, criminal law, and so on and so forth. Fourthly, I examine the energy and industrial policy, another sector where the war led to important changes in the Union. And last but not least, I also look at enlargement and reform, the enlargement policy and the reform debate within the European Union. Now, in my presentation, I'm not going to go through any of these 5 areas. We just don't have the time for it. And I'm sure Paul and Catherine have more interesting comments to make. So let me simply lay out here the core argument that I advance in the book. And basically, the thesis of the volume is a nuanced threefold argument that unfolds as follows. So the first thing that I try to point out in my volume is that actually in time of war, the EU treaties proved to be incredibly flexible to allow unprecedented policy and legislative action by the European Union in wartime. As you know, there is an important debate, especially in US constitutional law and in comparative law more generally, whether founding documents like constitutions have to be interpreted as living documents that are updated through interpretation over time, as opposed to original documents, which should be read exclusively through the eyes of the authors of those documents at the time when they were drafted. Well, definitely in the EU case, without taking a position on the American debate, but definitely the EU treaties proved to be a living constitution. So a new legal basis were all of a sudden discovered by EU institutions and deployed to deal with the unprecedented challenges of the war in Ukraine. However, and this is the second argument that I make in the book, the war also highlighted the existence of major shortcomings in the EU constitutional structure. Admittedly, some of these shortcomings were well known. They had already emerged in prior crises the EU faced, but others only became visible in the context of a continental conflict as we had not experienced since the end of World War II in Europe. And the shortcomings are to some extent twofold. On the one hand, the EU constitution introduces too many constraints on government action. This is a result of competence allocation as well as of institutional governance. So on some policy area, think of defense, think of fiscal and budgetary policy, the Union actually has only very limited authority that have been conferred on it on the treaties. And connected to this, often this authority can only be exercised through processes which require unanimous decision-making by intergovernmental institutions such as the European Council. Now, when that is the case, of course, the Union is incredibly constrained in its ability to act. It is low, it is inefficient, and often it also lacks the legitimacy to act with resolve in times of crisis. Now, this is clearly a problem. It's a problem that is visible in the lack of a real fiscal capacity for the EU, the absence of military capabilities, but also a governance structure which is largely unfit for wartime. And yet there is also a kind of an opposite pole in the structural weaknesses of the EU constitution. And this results, ironically, from the absence of adequate constraints on EU action. And there have been policy domain, especially in the field of sanction and legislation adopted in the area of freedom, security, and justice, where in fact, in my view, the European Union and its institution were capable of taking decisions which infringed on the individual liberties, the rule of law and respect for international law, because of the absence of adequate checks and balances and judicial review. So in a way, you have policy area where the Union was not able to do enough, and you also have examples, on the other hand, of policy areas where the Union perhaps did too much or acted in breach of human rights because of emergency needs. Now, both those elements are problematic. In the book, I quote two famous sentences, one from Abraham Lincoln that says, a constitution should not be a suicide pact, meaning a constitution must provide the means through which authorities are able to act also in emergency times. But the other citation is from Cicero, who famously said, laws should not be silent in time of war. And especially laws like constitutions that protect human rights and the rule of law must continue to play a role also in times of emergency when the cannons are roaring. So because of these dual weaknesses in the EU Constitution, the third and final argument I make in the book is that at the end of the day, the European Union needs to engage with constitutional reforms to tackle the structural shortcomings in the EU constitutional structure, to empower the union's institutions to act in time of need, but at the same time to constrain better EU institutions so that human rights and the rule of law continue to be respected. This is exactly what a constitution should be doing, enabling power but constraining powers through checks and balances and human rights. Now, the need for doing so, in my view, has increased, in fact, since November with the return of Donald Trump at the White House and major geostrategic changes in the transatlantic relationship. And therefore, despite the challenges that the EU faces in this direction, I think the issue of constitutional reform will be needed as most likely, unfortunately, hard power will become ever more important in international relations, and therefore an asset that the EU will have to leverage in its use. So I'll stop here. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to Paul's and Catherine's comments and to the discussion.
Well, thank you. And over to Paul.
Paul, you're muted, though.
Paul, you're muted. Yeah.
Okay, you can hear me now? Everyone can hear me? Okay, so thank you very much indeed for inviting me to participate in this webinar or book seminar. So let me begin. Federico has written a scholarly work which sheds valuable light on the legal dimensions that arise or have arisen from the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. It is well researched with a rich blend of analytical textual analysis combined with due attention given to the broader political and geopolitical environment that prevails in this area. The individual chapters are shaped by the same architectural frame, which facilitates comparison across and between the different topics covered in the book, which Federico has just outlined, the 5 different headings. Thus, each chapter begins with consideration of the core strategic measures adopted in the relevant area concerning defense, economic policy, and the like. That is followed by analysis of the consequences of adoption of the relevant measures, and there is then thought given to the challenges revealed by the legal measures adopted in each of the areas studied and the constraints imposed by the existing text of the treatise. So this is very much a work which is at the forefront of this particular topic. It repays careful reading, and Federico should be congratulated for publishing a work which is a scholarly work on a topic which straddles, as is clear from the book, a number of different important policy domains within the EU. Time precludes detailed examination of the many complex measures adopted by the EU during the course of this war, which are discussed by Federico in the book. I just want to make 4 more general points by way of reflection on the book and the analysis therein, and I hope Federico will take these in the spirit in which they're given, which is thoughts prompted by the nature of his work. So first, Federico uses the preamble from the US Constitution as a central part of the architectural frame of the book. It informs, in a literal sense, the title of each chapter, and informs, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, the substantive analysis therein. Federico acknowledges that that might be controversial for some, but defends the argument. With respect, I don't find the rationale for that approach intellectually or normatively convincing, and that's no disrespect to the US Constitution. My view on this is simply reflective of two related points. On the one hand, the US Constitution and the EU treaties are very different indeed, and to read the latter in the light of the preamble to the former is, I think, strained. The converse is also true in the following sense. Several issues discussed in the book would not be regarded as constitutional in the US or not in the same sense as in the EU. On the other hand, insofar as the terminology of the US Constitution can serve as headings for the subsequent chapters, that can only really be achieved by, in effect, treating those headings in a very abstract manner, such that they could be imbued with pretty much any content, thereby, I think, undermining the rationale for the cross-reference to the US system. Another way of putting this is we have 27 constitutions within the EU. If you want a constitutional point of reference, I think one of those, or more than one of those, would serve the frame. My second thought is linked, the preceding point is linked to a second issue, which concerns the intellectual frame of the substantive analysis, which, as Federico made clear in his presentation and is clear in the book, from the title and the content, it concerns the impact of the war on the EU constitution. Federico frames the legal changes resulting from the war as exemplifying the EU as a living constitution, contrary to originalist types of thought about constitutions. And that idea of a living constitution shows its adaptability and limitations in the context of the Ukraine-Russian war. This is really interesting. I also think we need to tread a little carefully. There is no doubt that there are certain respects in which the Lisbon Treaties and the interpretation thereof represent the EU constitution, and that is acknowledged more generally in the literature. There's also no doubt that there is a bit of a danger of reductionism in the use of that terminology. Federico uses the motif of constitutional change in relation to almost all interpretive development of pretty much all treaty articles that are relevant to this conflict. That then has twofold implications in more intellectual terms. On the one hand, it serves to highlight the very real difference between the, in inverted commas, EU constitution and pretty much everything else that goes under the nomenclature of constitution anywhere else in the world, including especially the US Constitution, which is pretty thin as constitutions go in terms of the number of articles and specificity of coverage. To put the same point another way, there are no constitutions with 350 plus articles. And in all other systems, there is a divide between constitutional analysis and other important, admittedly important legislation that may have some impact on the overall balance of power between the different branches of government. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, if constitutional change is accorded that breadth of meaning in the EU, then it follows that just about every important legislative and judicial development would have to be regarded as constitutional, thereby reducing the normative significance of that appellation. Or to put the same point in a converse manner, it's difficult to see what would not be regarded as constitutional in this respect. If we persist then with this very broad vision, then it behoves Federico to articulate the meaning that he or she accords to constitutional, and what the boundaries of that meaning actually are. Thirdly, my third point, and again, third point's related to the second but distinct, okay? And again, please let me emphasize, this is a scholarly work which is thought-provoking, which is why you're getting these thoughts, but it is thought-provoking. So let me put the third point on the table. It would be interesting, I think, to reflect or to hear Federico reflect in more normative detail on what one regards as the limits of legitimate treaty interpretation in the light of the circumstances that gave rise to the legislation enacted during the Ukraine-Russian conflict. Federico does indeed consider this at various points in the analysis. It would nonetheless be helpful to consider, stand back more generally, and reflect on what the implications of such developments are for treaty interpretation and division of competence. Just to take one very brief example, can we justify pretty much anything on the basis of Article 173 or 212, provided only that we do it for a just cause, for example, to help Ukraine? And I do think in this respect, it's important to be mindful not only of literature which supports the broad interpretation of those kinds of treaty articles, which I think is very powerful, partly from Federico himself, partly from Bruno de Witt, and other such scholarly writers. But equally, there is literature on the other side. There's the Leno-Sandberg-Ruffert article, which I don't think actually was discussed. I may be wrong. I couldn't find it in the bibliography, which pushes back on that expansive interpretation. Now, look, I actually agree with Federico and Bruno about the interpretation of those particular articles. But at the same time, I think it behoves us as scholars to actually, have a good nod to the other side and actually reflect on the counter arguments in detail. Fourth and final point, then I will be quiet, at least for the moment. Fourthly and finally, Federico, as he said in his helpful presentation, rightly points to the difficulties with attaining certain desired EU legal objectives relating to the Ukraine-Russia war within the framework of the existing treaties. He's absolutely right in the problems concerning unanimity and the attendant blackmail possibilities that this generates, gives rise to, in particular, when the blackmail is used by recalcitrant rule of law backsliding states such as Hungary, is a problem that Federico highlights with total justification throughout the book. And Federico suggests a number of desirable reforms in this respect, including inter alia, abolition of the unanimity requirement, EU power over direct tax, full fiscal capacity, CJEU jurisdiction over the CFSP, and empowerment of the EU to expend money on military operations. He also points to the fact that certain leaders, institutional and national, have at various times advocated for change of that kind. I think that's absolutely right. We should nonetheless be cautious about two different points in this respect, and I'm not suggesting anything here that Federico might not have thought of. I'm really not. The first is obvious, though. In empirical terms, it's pretty unlikely that member states are going to agree to changes of this dimension, given that each change that I've just listed involves a major change, institutional and or substantive, to the modus operandi of the EU. And each of those changes would require unanimity. And let's be clear as well that the present architecture of the EU is substantively determined by the member states and what they're willing to accept through successive treaty amendments. So empirically, the likelihood of such change happening is not high. The second point is less obvious, and it can be summed up in the following terms. Be careful what you wish for. The suggested reforms are predicated on an EU where, in a non-gender sense, the good guys, stroke liberal democratic states, remain in the ascendancy with, and again, non-gender specific sense, the bad guys, right-wing, populist, democratic backsliders confined to the annoying minority. You can see in those circumstances the attraction of moving away from unanimity to QMV across all areas, or pretty much all areas. However, we should not regard that picture as necessarily fixed in stone. It is not beyond peradventure that we could have an EU with the AfD in ascendancy in Germany, Le Pen et al. In France, combined with Meloni in Italy and Wilders in Holland, etc. The prospect of an EU with no veto power, power to tax and full fiscal capacity, and power to spend on military operations, then begins to look rather different when viewed from that perspective. Thank you very much indeed. And let me reiterate what I said at the beginning. This is a scholarly work. It is an adventurous work and an important work which covers many important and topical issues within this area prompted by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So please take the comments, the four comments, in the spirit in which they are intended, which is thoughtful responses to a very thoughtful book. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Paula. Over to you now, Catherine.
Thank you. Can you just check? Can you hear me okay? Thank you. First of all, I'm sitting actually in a hotel, and I'm afraid they've just turned the Christmas music on. So if you hear that in the background, that's what's going on. It might seem somewhat incongruous, but that's where we're at. I would like to thank Paul for his very helpful comments, and it would be quite quick for me to say I agree, and then we could move on. But I suspect that's probably not the rules of the game. So I will start by, first of all, thanking Federico for letting me see this impressive book, and also for the Oxford Global Legal Studies Group for organising this event. Now, I think this book is, as Paul said, extremely timely. It's nuanced, it is thoughtful, and it's extremely well structured, which makes it actually a very good and relatively easy, I use that in the legal sense, read. I also think it's timely because I think we are on the verge of something really very, very difficult geopolitically. And this is not something from the past, this is something going forward into the future. And having sons who are fighting age, I feel this very viscerally, that we are in a very, very dangerous geopolitical moment. at one level, I'm encouraged by the thought that the EU has been remarkably unified against Russia. And indeed, The Economist had an article this week which said that the EU's response to the war in Ukraine has put the Union back into the European Union. I wish I agreed with that, because as Federico makes very clear in his book, Hungary, Slovakia, Poland, up until recently, even Romania, have really demonstrated a lack of commitment, Hungary, of course, being the most egregious offender. Now, Federico makes three arguments in his book. The first is that the EU has proved flexible enough, and as his slide showed, he has looked at how legal acts have been adopted, not always straightforwardly, across the 5 areas that he identified. And I must say, one of the aspects of the book that I found extremely helpful was someone pulling together all of these many different legal acts, and also a reflection on the relevant legal bases and how the EU has tried to operate in actually a very complex legal architecture, whether it be under the old community pillar, or under the old Justice and Home Affairs pillar, or under the CFSP, CSDP parts of the treaty. And on a positive note, we can see just what's been done. And I think what Federico has pulled together here is of exceptional use. He then goes on as his second argument is to look at the limit of the EU constitution, particularly the structural constraints. And the structural constraints are, of course, related to those very legal bases, which in the earlier part of the book, he has said have been so facilitative, and also the governance shortcomings, the different architecture, whether it be intergovernmental or whether it be supranational, or somewhere in between. And then his third point, of course, is that the EU wartime constitution needs to be improved. And I think this is particularly important, and it's an issue I'll come back to slightly later in my comments. So, like Paul, I think this book is thoughtful and helpful, and has made me think quite a lot about issues that I have given too little attention to. And I have a range of points, but unlike Paul, they come out more as a smorgasbord rather than some fluent, coherent narrative. I think my first point about the book is a tension which perhaps is somewhat underexplored in the book, which is that ultimately war and the conduct of war is very much a matter for sovereign states. And the interesting question, I think, which is prompted by this book, is we know that there was huge pressure and expectations on the EU to act. The EU, which, as Federico very helpfully said right at the beginning, was very much set up as a peace project. And so if the EU is to act, where did the pressure come from? And why is it that the states decided to let the EU go ahead? Particularly at a time when NATO seems to be in the ascendancy. And certainly colleagues of mine who work in the defence industry say it's all NATO and it's not the EU, which raises the next question for me about the interrelationship between the EU and these other institutions, in particular NATO, but not exclusively that. Now, Paul has covered quite a lot of ground about the Constitution. What I would like to do is to look at something different. And I particularly want to think about where we go next. And it was very helpful to hear from Federico why he decided, quite understandably, to stop in November 24. Because although the EU, I think from Federico's narrative, has rather covered itself in glory in the way it has responded to this crisis, I think there is an argument that the response that the EU has delivered so far, to put it crudely, ain't seen nothing yet. And by that I mean, I think there is a serious concern about what will happen next. Because at a time of crisis, all of the resource is devoted to the crisis, and generally, with the notable exceptions of the states I've mentioned, at a time of crisis, the states have rallied together under the various headings and the various formations of the EU. But what happens when, and it will be a when eventually the war stops? What happens to the Baltic states? Will they feel that rallying of support that we saw for Ukraine? Or will we see the Western states fed up with bankrolling Central and Eastern European states? Will the Western states say, time has come to get our money back? We want to carry on trading with Russia. You're already seeing this through the US and the US's response to trying to get a quick fix to end the war with Ukraine. Secondly, and this really does speak directly to some of Federico's points, is what's going to happen to Ukraine itself. Will Ukraine become a member state of the European Union? Now, there are so many issues here, but I just want to highlight a couple. First of all, were Ukraine to join, it will be the biggest recipient of EU funds, regional funds, cohesion funds, and so forth. What does that mean for the other states which have so far been reliant on that money? Where is the extra money going to come from? What does it mean that Ukraine becomes the 5th largest state in the EU with a population of 41 million, or at least that was the population before the war? What's going to happen to all of those Ukrainian nationals who have been taken in by the EU member states and others? What's going to happen about reconstruction? Reconstruction, we know the issues from the summit yesterday about the use or otherwise of the 100 billion or so of the Russian assets. What is going to happen with that money? How is it going to be used? And what states are going to have a say over this? Will this be an EU matter? Will this be a member state matter? And also remember that some of the money is also in the UK, which is not, of course, a member state of the EU. There is also an issue that dare not speak its name, which is, of course, the levels of corruption in Ukraine. It used to be about 150th on the corruption index. It's still, I checked yesterday, 105th on the corruption index. How will the Nordics feel about having a state with that level of corruption and with huge amounts of money sloshing around in terms of reconstruction funds within the EU legal order? Now, I raise these as difficulties because these will be, I think, even bigger challenges than the challenges facing the EU to try and coordinate member states at the time of war. But on a more positive note, I think it also gives the EU finally the opportunity to experiment with variable geometry that we have not seen before. We haven't seen a really genuine desire to address what variable geometry might mean in the advent of having significant expansion. Will the European political community have any meaning? I somehow doubt it, but is it nascent for some form of outer tier membership? How does NATO fit into all of these structures? Which brings me then to the final point I would like to make, which actually coincides with Paul's final point, which is about reform of the EU governance mechanism. Everyone agrees that the EU needs reform in some form, whether it's not just the number of commissioners or the number of judges at the Court of Justice, but it's like writing through a stick of rock. There is so much that needs to be thought about in terms of enlargement up to 35. And of course, all of this will require significant treaty reform. The recent conference on the future of Europe, which Federico refers to quite optimistically, I think, in his book, has, in my view, been a damp squib, not least because 13 member states promptly said, we're having none of that. But in fact, at the moment, the EU seems to me to be ducking the biggest question facing it, which is reform both in the time of war and in the time of post-war, an issue so important that it's in the box marked too difficult. And at the moment, the war gives it coverage not to address some of these very fundamental issues. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very, very much indeed, Catherine. Federico, I think we should give you a chance to reply to all these very interesting comments. We also have 2 questions in the 2 Q&A box, which I only had a chance to look at very quickly. They seem to relate to more military aspects of your work. So maybe if you could respond to Paul and Catherine's questions, but leave a little time so we can take a look at those questions as well. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Shauna, for giving me back the floor. And I really would like to thank Paul and Catherine for their own thought-provoking comments on my book. And I am truly honored and humbled that 2 great scholars that I so much admire and that have been mentors and models for me over the years have taken the time to read the book so carefully and share their thoughts. So I really appreciate it. And I'm glad that the book also led to critical points and issues to be discussed. So thanks a lot for that. I'll try maybe to reply by addressing 3 points. And I know in advance I can't do justice to the wealth of comments I have received, but I've made a note of them, Catherine and Paul, and so I will keep reflecting on those. So I'll maybe pick the 3 issues that it seemed to me were kind of central also in the critical remarks. The first one is on the comparison. The second is on the constitutional dimension, and the third one, it's looking at the future, including the issue of reform. So I'll start with the comparison, and Paul really nailed me on what is possibly one of the most controversial choices I made in the book, which is to use wording from the preamble of the American Constitution as a catchy way to structure the book and also title the various chapters, the substantive chapters of the book. And I can disclose that actually this was a point that was central to the discussion also with the reviewers at Oxford University Press and with the commissioning editor, some of whom said, well, you don't need that. Just, title your chapter CFSP, budget, AFSJ, without any reference to the US Constitution. It doesn't really change so much. And then I insisted on keeping it. And I just would like to maybe provide a couple of reasons for doing so. One is, of course, that as Paul knows, since he has followed my work over the years, I've been a fan of comparing the EU with the United States in all my research career. I've always thought, in line with the Integration Through Law project at the European University Institute, that the American federal experience provides a very helpful sort of comparative benchmark to understand what's going on in the EU. And so I kind of wanted to jump into or continue operate in that line of thought, and therefore examine how the EU reacted in wartime by comparing it, also using the language of a federal system that has been dealing with these issues for longer. But then the second argument, or if you will, the reverse side of the coin, I also thought that by using wording from the American Constitution, the book could resonate with a broader audience. And here, I think it's fair to say, Catherine, Paul, Shauna, and I have been working in EU law. One of the weaknesses of our field is it tends to be a little bit self-referential, and people around the world don't really understand what the EU is because of all its acronyms, its complexities, and so on and so forth. And so by using language from the American Constitution, which is probably one of the most well-known legal documents in the world, I just thought I could do a bridging or translation exercise. So to make accessible to non-EU law specialists the policy areas or the domains which I wanted to examine and which have been affected by the war. However, with all that said, I do agree also with what Paul said, that to some extent I am kind of forcing the comparison here. So I think I admitted somewhere in the opening chapter that I use this mostly as a rhetorical tool rather than an analytical one to some extent. So touché. Let me come to the second point, which is about the constitutional dimension. And I think here Paul addressed it, but also Catherine referred to it when she raised the point, why are member states, which are sovereign in foreign affairs and defense, are actually acting within the EU. And I think this is really the interesting thing to me, that for the first time in history, the European Union responded to Russia's aggression against Ukraine as a union. And this was not a given. Of course, there were many wars, including in the EU's backyard, if you will, if I'm allowed to use the word in inverted quotes. Think of Yugoslavia, but think also of the Middle East, which is, of course, very close to Europe borders, where the European Union did not act as a union. The states acted independently, separately, perhaps through other international organizations like NATO or the UN. This time, for the first time, a deliberate decision was used to operate within the framework of the EU for sanction, for financial support, for the phasing out of energy, for the development of defense industrial policy, and of course, enlargement and other policy areas. And I think this reflects to some extent a kind of post-Brexit dividend in the European Union, where states have somehow realized that their future is within the Union, despite of course, the rise of nationalist and populist parties across the continent. I think the negative experience of the United Kingdom leaving has a little bit ruled out the options of going it alone. And so, in a way or another, member states have to act within the EU and decided to act through the EU for dealing with war. And that makes the EU structure of governance more constitutional, in my opinion. And so that's why I'm using the word constitutional quite a lot in the text. And admittedly, I do it with some liberty here too. Of course, there is no such document as a European constitution. It is quite normal for the Court of Justice to use the constitutional language in the scholarship. It is common. But in using constitutional lato sensu, or with a lowercase c, I think, again, I'm also trying to break down the sort of the rigid approaches to EU law. Of course, constitutions are different things around the world. The British don't have a written constitution, and yet, by all means, they have a form of constitutional law. And also constitutional documents can be of different size. The American Constitution has notoriously only 7 articles, but Brazil has a constitution of 350, in fact, a longer one than the Treaty on the Functioning of the EU. So once we agree that, in fact, that term can be used with a little bit more flexibility, I think it fits to examine what the EU has been doing in response to the war and how its constitution has also changed in response to the war. With that said, and I'll end on this point, I also think using the word constitution carries with it implicitly the duty to assess the constitutionality of measure. And so I think, Paul, you raised this issue, and I fully agree with it. The fact that the Constitution is flexible doesn't free us from the responsibility of assessing whether institutions act within the constitutional boundaries. And as I try to argue in the book here and there, sometimes the institutions have not respected those boundaries. I think, for example, the expropriation of Russian assets is not compatible with the constitutional obligation of the EU to comply with international law. And also, there are some constitutional boundaries that it's simply impossible to circumvent. Article 41.2, for example, is a rock-solid rule that says you can't use the EU budget for military operation. Is a rule that was adopted at a time when hard power didn't seem to be of any relevance for the euro, but it is a rule that is constraining action of the European Union. And as we speak, of course, litigation is actually playing out on the legality of other measures. The use of Article 122. Most recently, the Parliament challenged that the Council regulation establishing the Security Action for Europe, SAFE. It's a special fund to support rearmament, which is based on 122, but there are also pending cases on the use of Article 122 for energy intervention measures by private parties. So we will need to see what the court has to say about that. And I guess that takes me to the third and final point I wanted to make, given the little amount of time, which is a little bit looking at the future, as Catherine said, and connected to this also the issue of reform. In a way, I fully agree with Catherine that this is not the beginning. Maybe it's just the beginning of the end, or the end of the beginning. You know, as they say, it's the end, beginning of the end, the end of the beginning. The war has been a major challenge for the European Union, but what has happened since the return of Donald Trump to the White House has only worsened things. And looking ahead for the EU is going to be even more difficult because, for example, in foreign affairs, as I point out in the book, it was really NATO that played the main institutional function of helping Ukraine and securing Ukraine armed forces, the weapons it needed, and so on. And most likely the role of NATO will be very different moving ahead. Same about integration of Ukraine in the EU. Is going to be extremely expensive, institutionally difficult, raising lots of issues in terms of rule of law compliance, and so on and so forth. And is the governance of the EU, which at 27 is already pretty rusty, going to work with 35 or more member states? I frankly doubt it. And so we are in a situation where clearly there is a sense that reform is needed. There is an awareness that getting those reforms done at 27 will be close to impossible. And so we need new ideas there. And I just want to flag that from this point of view, I've now launched a project that is somehow a follow-up to my book. Is a project called Alcide, and I'm going to share here just the final slide of my presentation, where I had I wanted to just draw your attention to the logo of this project. Alcide stands for Activating the Law Creatively to Integrate Defense in Europe. Is a project that is based at the Dublin European Law Institute of DCU. And the idea here is that actually to move forward with integrating defense and making Europe more ready for geostrategic challenges, we need to look backward at the early days of European integration, especially the European Defense Community of 1952, which was created as a union specifically designed to protect Europe from a Russian aggression at a time when the United States was not fully committed yet to European defense. So this is just an idea of how to do it, but I think the bottom line of relaunching the European Defense Community is that it would be a way to act outside the constraints of treaty reform at 27, hence through a form of variable geometry and avant-garde action by a group of member states. And increasingly, it seems to me we are moving in this direction. The coalition of the willing is a starting point, perhaps is not sufficient, but it points out to a direction. So
that was great. I just wondered if you had a chance to look at the questions at all, because we're running out of time now. I don't know if it's going to get cut off, but there was a question about the impact of reforms to the EU constitution on the private military security groups, and also on the phenomenon of lawfare used by Russia. Maybe you could just say a short word about that.
Yes, thanks to the two persons that raised the question. So with regard to the first one, I have not specifically examined the use of sort of military security groups in response to the war. This is definitely part of a hybrid type of war. That connects, of course, to the second question in the chat as well. Increasingly, this will be one of the challenges that the European Union faces: new forms of asymmetric war, cyber warfare, attack to critical infrastructure, measures by hostile power that undermine the security of war supplies, access to critical raw materials. Once again, also in that area, the European Union has responded. The whole field of industrial policy, the development of a European economic security strategy is exactly part of that, and I examine those questions in the book. I will maybe just end by pointing out this is a shift away from the Kantian mindset, which had underpinned the EU developments for 75 years. This idea of perpetual peace, this idea of Wandel durch Handel, as the Germans say, transformation through trade, that by being open and doing economic deals with other powers, we could make war impossible. Unfortunately, I think in the last 3 years, the EU has realized that this is no longer true. And in the last 12 months, since the return of Donald Trump to the White House, that process had only increased its urgency.
Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're out of time, so we don't have any more time for discussions. But thank you very much to our 3 participants, Federico, Paul, and Catherine. And I hope everybody will go and read this wonderful book. And thank you to OXGS for hosting this.
And thank you, Shauna, for chairing and suggesting this in the first place.
Okay, bye.
Thank you very much, everybody.